Okay, so this has to do with infection. And so there will be more information from these chapters, this 12, 13, 14. Let me look at the syllabus again. 12, 13, 14, 15. So there will be more information from those chapters by far on this last lecture test. And then the 18 through 25, I'll just be picking out a few general pieces of information about the categories of microbes and how they relate to this medical section. So that's kind of how that will go. So we're going to spend a lot more time on these first chapters than we will on those last ones. If you're like, how are we going to get through so many chapters later? It doesn't even really look like she covers them. So that's how that works. Okay, so this one is pretty important. This is summarizing a lot. This is one of those slides to pay attention to. So, okay, this one is looking at how microbes make it into us and what those words mean as far as contact, invasion, and infection. So you can see those different, colonization too. You can see those different steps, but then you'll also notice the action of the microbes in blue and kind of what the beneficial side effect to that is, and then the adverse side effect. And this is kind of from the point of view of the microbes. Okay, so the first step you see is the contact, and that is when microbes are just exposed to us, okay? So in whatever method that is, and we'll go through all the methods later, but in this picture they're showing it as gaining access to our nasal cavity. And then the microbes will colonize us, and that's what they're showing, attaching into the tissues, or at least, you know, being able to reproduce or get towards the area where they can reproduce. And then we have invasion, and that's when they actually will cross our lines of defense. So for example, you could have contact and colonization, which means they have exposure to our body, but then our regular lines of defense discourage them from surviving or wash them and destroy them. So for example, if we would have succeeded in not having this step take place, that would be, for example, the bacteria were caught in the mucus, and it was swiftly enough moved to the throat, and we swallowed it, and our stomach acid killed them. Okay, so in that case, we would have avoided step 3. But step 3 assumes that we have made contact here, and they have successfully then infected us. So this is the infection stage, is when they can actually multiply in the tissues. Because the reason that's important, the reason that's its own step, is because if they only invade us but never multiply, it's likely that there's never going to be enough of them to make us sick. Okay, we will talk about the infectious dose later, but just because you are in step 3, just because you've been invaded, does not mean that you will be feeling the symptoms of that. The symptoms of the sickness are going to come during the infection stage, when they are rapidly multiplying. And instead of the few thousand maybe that infected you, now there are millions of them running around your body. Okay, whoops. Okay, so then your body has a couple of options. You can defeat the pathogen, and then if it was a high enough exposure, you may have formed immunity to it and repair the damage, and everything's fine. The other option is that you can get sick, and that will possibly cause you to have mortality then. Morbidity means sickness, mortality means death. So one of those are also possible. And so this is, you know, typically what happens with most diseases. Most pathogens will end in one of these 3 methods. You get better, or sorry, you have no damage really, you get sick, you die. But you can also have a carrier state develop, in which the microbes are there and hanging out in the body, but you're not feeling sick from them. And sometimes that will happen after the initial sickness, like where you actually feel sick. And sometimes it happens with no early symptoms. Okay, so it can be either or. You can get sick and then become a carrier, or never get sick and still be a carrier. Okay, that does happen both ways, and COVID has shown us that. So the typical asymptomatic carrier is what we're talking about there, but you could also be a long-term carrier, as you are with something like chickenpox. Okay, the chickenpox virus is still in you. It's not making you sick, and you're not spreading it because it's staying contained where it is. So there are a lot of options there for that carrier state. Okay, and the reason that this beneficial effect right here is mentioned is because, you know, if you are fine after the exposure, then that's a beneficial thing for you, obviously. Okay. So something else that we need to understand is that not all areas is it a problem to have microbes. So these are sites that harbor normal microbes that you live with all day, every day, and there's no problem whatsoever. And these areas really are covered in microbes. And like I said, most of them are no problem at all. So these are very common areas. All of the epithelial tissues are basically what we are listing here. So skin, upper respiratory tract, digestive tract, the opening of the urethra, so just the end part of the urinary tract, external genitalia, that goes with skin, but then internal, here we have the vagina, external ear and canal, like that's where you would use a Q-tip, and external eye are all normal places where we're going to have bacteria all the time. These are tissues, though, where we should not. And so if the bacteria get here, then regardless of what type it is, it might cause a problem. And you can see those are just all internal tissues and organs. Again, noticing that the GI tract and the respiratory tract are external, so they were on the other list. And then middle and inner ear, that's one to point out. Sinuses is another one to point out. You should not normally have them growing there. And then glands, this is the other epithelial. This is the only epithelial that's in here, except for the blood vessels, right? That's that lining of blood vessels is epithelial as well. So those are places where we should not find microbes at all. And make sure, sorry, with this one, the saliva prior to entering the oral cavity. So your salivary glands, the insides of those are going to be sterile, but then once it enters the oral cavity, of course, it's not. Okay, here's a couple of other terms that we should know. Transients are bacteria that would only stay with you for a few days, and residents are ones that become established so that you always have them around. And when disturbed, that means like if you take an antibiotic or if you wash your hands with something that is a very strong antiseptic, they will reestablish themselves because you probably can't kill all of them, and so they'll just start regrowing over to where they were, or they're just so common in the environment that they become residents again from just contact exposure to other people. And our immune defenses are kind to these resident microbes, or if they're not, like if they would be able to recognize them as not ours, then the microbes have really strong cloaking devices, which means they can kind of hide from our immune systems. So either our immune systems tolerate those microbes, or the microbes have cloaking devices that would allow them to hide from our immune system. But at any rate, our immune system should leave them alone because it's okay for them to be there. Okay, and the colonization of our body starts almost immediately after birth. And really, during the birth of the baby, if it is a vaginal baby, it will receive more microbes than a cesarean baby. And that can last for, that difference, I mean, can last for months. So a vaginally born baby will have a more robust microbiota compared to babies that are born by C-section. And we see the same thing in breastfed babies as well. Their natural bacteria is different than a formula-fed baby. Okay, just different species. And that can even affect the weight of the baby because of the types of bacteria that are found there. So some interesting differences. This is also just showing just regular people holding and talking to your baby gives them their start of their microbiota, and doctor visits, anybody touching the baby will spread their bacteria to them. Okay, I do not expect you to memorize any of these long lists of what are common here. I do want you to notice one thing though, that the skin is a common place for both bacteria, fungi, and arthropods. Think of arthropods as like little insects. The GI and oral cavity, though smaller, we don't find the arthropods anymore. This might be, even like ticks or lice, anything like that. But in the GI tract and the oral cavity, a smaller species. So only bacteria, fungi, and then protozoa, those microscopic ones here. Same thing in the large intestine, rectum. And then in the upper respiratory tract, again, just bacterial fungi colonies. So only on the skin do we find the arthropods, but everywhere else, bacteria and fungi are common, and protozoa. And I think, yeah, this continues, and then I think we look at pictures. In the genital tract, same thing. We lose the protozoa, thankfully. Candida, yeast infection is what we're talking about here. Urinary tract, same, just bacteria, eye, bacteria, ear, bacteria, fungi. So I just want you to see that trend of bacteria and fungi can kind of find their way almost everywhere. Arthropods on the skin, protozoa in the digestive tract. And if you want to review any of that information, these summaries are pretty good. All right, so here are the pictures, and I just want to emphasize that, again, this is where you would expect to see infections can be possible, but this is also the place where just your resident microbiota is located. So if we're looking at the skin, obviously in the top layers is the skin, but then down into the hair follicles, okay, down into the glands. And we know this if you have like a zit, that is just a clogged pore, and if it gets extra big and inflamed, then that could mean that there's bacteria down in here. A zit is just when this gets clogged, and then your body has to work to inflame this a little bit to get that out. But if it gets severely inflamed, then you might have a bacterial infection there. Here is the oral cavity and large intestine. Remember, we saw similar species there. Respiratory passageways. And then this is one that I would like to spend just a little bit more time on because we see some differences between male and female genital areas. So obviously external surfaces are going to be common sites of normal microbiota, but then also slightly up the female urethra, okay? As you urinate, it'll wash that area out, but because this is so close to the exposed surface, you can find some bacteria that far. But then all the way up the vagina, because it is a larger area, okay, even to the beginning of the cervix there. And then on males, mostly external here, the external reproductive surfaces, and then again, just slightly up the urethra, not too far, just slightly. All right, now this is an interesting look at, well, why shouldn't we just try really hard to just be germ-free? And this last year, where we have been a lot less germy because we've all been trying to avoid each other's respiratory secretions, very few anyway, very few people are getting the flu, very few people are getting just colds because we're protecting ourselves from that so much. So you might think, well, that's a great thing, right? Because then, everybody will be healthier and that's fine. But this is what happens, this is what they see in animals when they are raised germ-free. And think, was it in this class that I talked about that? I think it was in my Bio 139 when we talked about the digestive system, but maybe I'm wrong. The germ-free mice that they raised and what happens when you transfer the gut bacteria from one regular mouse into this one, their bodies change. Or if you take gut bacteria from a fat mouse and put it into one of these germ-free mice, then the germ-free mice gain weight and become obese as well. And then if it comes from a healthy weight mouse, then the germ-free mouse becomes a healthy weight mouse. So anyway, this is worth looking through. So this is what germ-free animals show, okay? And this column right here, and then this is the significance of that, like why is that a problem? So enlargement of the cecum and other degenerative diseases of the intestinal tracts, and that's a problem. The reason that happens is because microbes are needed for normal intestinal development. So isn't that interesting? Just by having no microbes, the intestines don't develop properly. Okay, so in other words, the bacteria are controlling the way that our body grows. We see vitamin deficiency in some animals, and we should know this from Bio 139 because microbes can give us a lot of our vitamins because they are living inside of us, digesting our food, and then the vitamins are a byproduct that our body can absorb. Underdevelopment of an immune system in most animals that are germ-free because microbes are needed to stimulate the development of your immune system. So without anything to fight, your immune system stays immature. No tooth decay or periodontal disease in germ-free animals because microbes are the cause of that. So that's not unexpected at all. We know that. Heightened susceptibility to certain pathogens and fungal infections. So if you have normal bacteria, then those certain species are less likely to be able to take hold. But without your normal bacteria, then they can take hold easily. Lessened susceptibility to amoebic dysentery, though. So this is interesting. Normal resident microbes facilitate the completion of the life cycle of the amoeba in the gut. So the amoeba are feeding on the normal gut bacteria probably, and so in that or other ways they are helping that amoeba survive in the gut so it can replicate. Without them, you don't have that problem. So that's one of the few benefits. Less body fat in germ-free animals. And this is why, so you might seem to think like that's a good thing, but evolutionarily that would not be a good thing. Normal microbes help to break down the indigestible bits, so you get a little bit more nutrients out of the food that's going through your GI tract. So without those microbes, you don't have that extra benefit. Increased anxiety and nervousness. So mice are much more sensitive to stressful conditions if they don't have their regular microbe level. So that last one I think is especially interesting for humans, and I'm not saying that this does occur in humans, although there is some evidence that it does, that because we're not truly germ-free even after taking a round of antibiotics, we're not truly germ-free, but we are much closer to it. And we know that when your normal microbiota is off balance, it can cause mental effects. Okay, we know that for sure. So some pretty interesting topics there for why don't, this is definitely an argument against being germ-free. Okay, so this next image is looking at how microbes can do what they do so well. And so these are kind of the stages of microbial penetration. So first they have to find a portal of entry because most of our defenses are pretty good at keeping them out. So they have to find a cut through the skin, for example, or maybe traveling in with some food in the GI tract and the stomach just can't work fast enough to kill them. Respiratory tract, urogenital tract, endogenous biota. And so this endogenous biota could just be they're already living there, but maybe they're going to sneak in on another. That could be another example. Then they have to hold on. They have to stick around so that they don't just get washed out through mucus or digestive juices. So fimbriae, remember those are the long, they almost look like flagella, but they're sticky. They're meant for holding on. Capsules can help them survive in, stomach acid, for example. Surface proteins could help them hold on. Viral spikes help them penetrate cells. And hooks, like for example on hookworms, can help them hold on. And then they have to survive the host defenses. So they've got it really rough. First they have to get in, then they have to attach or stick around somehow, and then they have to evade the immune system. Avoid all the phagocytizers. And then they will cause some damage in us. And so it can be direct damage through releasing toxins, enzymes, or causing lysis of our tissues. Or it can be indirect damage, and our body's response is too much. So the example there would be something like a fever that goes too high, or a complement cascade that kind of goes, excuse me, too fast. So our response could be the problem. Now, this is a very important time to bring up the issue here of why do you feel sick when you're sick? It is two different possibilities. One, the bacteria or virus is doing something to cause you pain, like releasing a toxin or killing your cells. That's one thing. And it's your body's immune response, because that often feels icky too. So, the fever doesn't feel good. The fever makes you have aches. The amount of mucus that your body is producing to try to wash away the microbe is making you all stuffed up and miserable. So those immune responses can be just as bad as the any possible damage that the bacteria is doing, okay, or virus or protist. But in some cases, another one, vomiting or diarrhea, that is your body's response. Yes, it's the bacteria that it invaded you, but the bacteria isn't making you vomit. Your body is making you vomit. Does that make sense? Okay, so they might be releasing toxins that your body is saying, we got to get rid of this bacteria, let's vomit it out. But it's not as though the bacteria is releasing something that's going to make you do that directly, right? It's not going to make you do, the bacteria is not going to release a toxin that seizes your stomach muscles, for example. Okay. And then if you are a very successful bacteria, you really do want to exit your host, because your job is to spread to another healthy host and continue going on. Okay, so portals of exit now are often the same way that they came in, but respiratory tract, salivary glands, urogenital tract, those are fecal matter, and that would be all common entry points as well. Skin cells being sloughed off, that's another, opposite of the entry point. But then blood is the new one. If there are some species that have to get into and out of the body through blood, and they don't survive long outside of the blood. So for those, think about something that is passed from person to person through drug needles. That would be an example, okay? Or sexual intercourse, that could potentially pass a few of the blood-borne organisms. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words today. Okay, these are things that will weaken your natural defense against these pathogens. And so the older that we get and the younger that we are, the less our immune system is able to respond. Genetic defects in immunity and acquired defects in immunity, so those would be times when your white blood cell count is not where it should be. And so that could be a genetic issue, or you could have developed some immune disorder. Surgery and organ transplants, because now we have exposed those sensitive tissues inside the body to the outside world that were previously sterile. Other forms of disease like cancer, liver malfunction, diabetes, because your body is being taxed in other ways and will have a more difficult time responding properly with the immune system. Anything that suppresses the immune system, like the immunosuppressive drugs or chemotherapy that is killing newly developing cells, because our body is always making new red and white blood cells. Physical and mental stress, I always bring this one up to my nurses because that mental stress is going to be an issue. Mental stress weakens the immune system. That's something very important to understand. That doesn't mean I expect you to be a stress-free nurse, but it does mean that I expect you to take care of that mental state and seek counseling and be able to leave the job when you go home at night, those kinds of things. You have to learn how to cope with the stress, and then it does not do as much damage. I was just reading something about, see if I can get this right. It was a study where they looked at different groups of people who all had about the same level of stress. And so they were looking at, trying to remember what they measured. I want to say it was a direct immune response, but I feel like it was more complicated than that. But at any rate, they were facing the same level of stress, and if you perceived that the stress was going to harm your health, then it did more so than if you perceived that the stress was just stress and you were not going to be affected by it much. And I thought that was really interesting because this is just an educational issue on the surface. Like, some people would never say, oh yes, stress will cause me to have a weakened immune system, for example. But it seems as though if you dwell on that and tell yourself, oh, I'm stressed out, I'm going to get sick, that makes it more likely to become so. So you have to, and our brain has a lot of power in this field, and so we need to be able to cope with the stress properly so that it does not harm our health. So just being aware of the fact that it can harm your health hopefully will make it more likely to do so. Okay, and then other infections too. If you're facing one infection and you get a second one, that's bad. And that's one of the big reasons that they still want people to get the flu shot, because even though we're all staying away from each other, if you get the flu and COVID, which is totally possible, then your body's having to fight 2 infections at once, and that is not good. Okay. Just skipping through some. Okay, this one. This is a very important topic for understanding how easily microbes can be spread from one person to another. So this is the infectious dose, and this is the number of pathogens, the individuals that you must be exposed to be sick. Okay, so you can see with the measles, it is 1 individual virus is all you need for that one virus to get into a cell and start replicating before the immune system can catch up with it. Because that's the thing. I'll use a different example. Let's use this cholera up here with this 100 million cells. That's how many cholera it takes, cholera bacterial cells, to become actually infected so that you feel sick from cholera. So if you're only exposed to, let's say, 200 cells, your immune system can conquer those before you get sick. Okay, so that's what the infectious dose means. It's how many can you be exposed to and get sick. So this is like the minimum that you can be exposed to that will get you sick. COVID-19, I've seen some different numbers on that one, but somewhere in the hundreds. So it's pretty contagious by that standard. Okay, so it's not a whole lot of, I'm sorry, that should say viruses, not cells. Sorry, my typo there. And you can see that some of these, like smallpox, that's one that they're really worried about being, you know, a bioterror pathogen because it doesn't take many. If you can expose somebody to 20 viruses, smallpox viruses, then they're going to get infected. And so if you can just deliver that to their body, you know, I don't know if you've ever seen any of those like crazy movies where they do that. They use like a bioterror pathogen and put it in the water, or just blow it gently in somebody's face as they walk by. That's all it can take. So they are definitely worried about things like smallpox that are easily moved from one person to another. Okay. Some of these we've already talked about, so I'm skipping through them. All right, remember with the endotoxins, those are produced inside of the cell, and exotoxins are released outside of the cell. And the one thing I want to point out on this is that the endotoxins may not make you feel bad until the bacteria are already starting to die. And the reason that I'm pointing that out is because this happens to some people when they are sick and then they take an antibiotic. So I'll explain, if you have this kind of a bacteria inside of you, what it might feel like. So remember the bacterial growth curve that kind of goes up a little bit and then back down. You know, when you are in that plateau stage, that bacteria is going to be in you, and there are going to be some living and some dying. And the ones that are dying are going to be releasing those endotoxins from their cell wall as they die. Okay, so that makes you feel sick. That is one part of the symptoms that you would be feeling, is sick from the bacterial toxins. Okay, and so after a little while, though, when you're taking the antibiotic, you may have a period where you don't feel as many symptoms, and then as the bacteria, because you're already starting to feel a little bit better maybe, and so the bacteria are kind of just chilling a little bit, but then you take the antibiotic and now you wipe them all out, and then you start feeling worse. And so you might be thinking, well, the antibiotic's not working or something like that, but what's really happening is that the more of the cells are dying, and so therefore the endotoxins are being released, and you're going to feel really bad for a little while. Unfortunately, what can also happen is that once that stops, once those symptoms stop because you've killed off a lot of them, then you stop taking the antibiotic, as people so often do, before they're supposed to, while there are still some that are alive in there. Okay, and then, you know, the whole issue with antibiotic resistance can come up too. Okay. All right. Another interesting difference between the two is that exotoxins usually don't cause a fever, but endotoxins do. And all gram-negative bacteria here are the ones that produce the endotoxins. I don't really test on that, though, so don't worry too much about that. All right, so this is definitely something you should know. You should be able to label this. This is just as important as the bacterial growth curve, but this is instead the symptom curve, or the infection curve, basically. So you are exposed to the microbe, whether it's a bacteria or virus, and then there's this incubation period where they are invading your cells and starting to reproduce, but they're still at a pretty low level. And your body is certainly aware at this point. Your body will be starting to fight these pathogens at this point. But then you go through this prodromal stage where your symptoms escalate severely, but you are definitely not in the throes of it. This would be, for example, when you start to just like, I don't know, maybe I feel a little tired. Maybe I'm starting to feel like a little achiness. I don't have a fever yet, but maybe I just feel like a little stiff maybe. Like I usually will feel mine kind of like in my back first. I'm like, uh-oh, I know it's coming. That's that prodromal stage where you think, maybe I'm going to be sick. And you are definitely infectious during that prodromal stage with most microbes. And then we have this period of fast invasion where the microbe's going to be spreading throughout the body and you're going to be feeling the worst. Okay, by now your immune system is really kicked up and you're feeling the symptoms from the microbe and from your immune system as it's fighting it. And then they will have the microbes under control and being defeated, and then you will be going through the convalescent period. And that can just be extreme tiredness, trying to remove all of those immune molecules that have been circulating that maybe have made you stuffed up in the nose, for example, made your stomach queasy. All of that has to kind of go back into homeostasis. So that's that convalescent period, which can take quite a bit of energy from your body, even during that stage as it's trying to return everything back to normal. Okay, so during these phases, know what the microbe is doing, and then know how your body is responding to it, and so therefore how your body's feeling. Okay, this incubation period, you don't really feel anything, if that wasn't clear before. This one, you're just starting to feel a little weird, a little icky, maybe a tiny bit tired, and then this is where you have the full-blown symptoms, and then you're starting to feel better, but it's still going to be, you know, tiredness and recovering from some of those symptoms. Okay, this is also a very important topic, the difference between signs and symptoms. I bring this up in Bio 137 and I talk about it, but now it's important to understand these. And these ones do, some of them go hand in hand, meaning fever is a sign because you can measure the increase in temperature, but the symptom that you might feel from that is chills, okay? But these don't all go the same side to side, okay? So let's go over the signs first. These are things that you could see in a person that are wrong with them. Septicemia, because you can look at it under a microscope. You could see microbes in places that should be sterile. You can measure, you can see microbes in those places. Abnormal chest sounds, so an irregular heartbeat, usually elevated. Skin eruptions like boils and rashes. Leukocytosis, so dead, or the number of cells, lack of them, and then leukopenia, a lot of them. So you can know what kind of disease a person has based on which white blood cells are high or low. Swollen lymph nodes, because those lymphatic tissues are working overtime to clear the infection. So they'll swell up as a, you know, just like a busier factory would be more full of people. A busier lymph node is more full of white blood cells and fluid. Abscesses, so, you know, swollen areas that are full of fluid. Tachycardia, antibodies in the serum, so you can measure antibodies. Those are all things that you can measure from the outside. These ones are all how you feel, okay? And of course there are more, but it's just a list. I'm not going to read through all of those because we all have those kinds of symptoms. Oops. Okay, I'm not going to go into this much at all, but you should definitely know that a zoonotic infection is one that comes from an animal or an insect. Okay, it has a zoological reservoir, okay, which means that we get it from somewhere else. They were hypothesizing that COVID was that way. Most likely is because it's very similar to a mammalian coronavirus. Okay, so let's talk about direct versus indirect transmission of pathogens. So in the direct transmission, this one, most students have no trouble with. This is pretty commonly known. You can have direct contact with somebody, and they give you a few examples there. Respiratory. And I want to point out really quickly here, there's this respiratory here, and then there's aerosols here. Okay, so we can have respiratory being both direct and indirect. We'll talk about that later. I just want to point that out. Respiratory being a direct transmission means, like they're showing here, talking at somebody, sneezing in their face, those kinds of direct contacts. Sharing a drink with somebody, that kind of thing, because you're so close to them, it's going directly from one to another. Vertical is the term that we use from mother to child. Okay, so that, you know, some viruses, for example, are small enough to pass through the placenta. Or a biological vector like a mosquito, because the mosquito essentially has the pathogen and it's giving it to you. Okay, so a lot of people say, well, didn't it come from a human? Yes, but it was directly in the mosquito, and then it was directly in you. So that is considered a direct transmission. Okay. For the indirect, over here in green, you can see it splits into two main categories: fomites and then airborne microbes. Okay, we'll talk about the fomites first. So fomites are when something is contaminated, and so they broke it up into two kind of just regular inanimate objects, like you touching a handle that somebody else had just touched, but also food and water that you're going to be eating. Okay, those are both considered fomites. And then for the airborne microbes, we can see that some species can live pretty well in the air and just kind of hang out in the air in a room for minutes to hours or even longer. But then also from wherever it was, like in the dirt, and then being kicked up into the air. So that's an aerosol. It's not coming out of somebody's breath, so we don't call it a respiratory droplet, but it is something else that's in the air. Okay, see how those two are different? All right. Oh, that's so gross. I hate looking at stuff like that. Like, that's a normal sneeze. The reason they can capture it like that is because of the black background and the high-speed camera that they use. But that's just a typical sneeze. Totally gross. Especially right now. Okay. I don't think we need to go over any of these in detail. This is interesting to look at, but I won't be quizzing you on any of these. But it is interesting to see where most infections are found as far as the entry points. And you can, you know, with our respiratory tract being so high on that list, you can see why everybody's had fewer respiratory infections this year. And then also, you know, things like skin and GI tract, because we're sanitizing more, those will also have a secondary decrease too. At times when we're being careful about COVID, I mean. Okay, so what can you do to prevent the spread of different pathogens when you're in a clinical setting? So this is, I'm not going to go over this in a whole lot of detail because that's going to be covered in your nursing program, but just a little bit here. For enteric precautions, so this is, you know, against GI infections. So gowns and gloves are worn, and if you're disposing of feces and urine and the person has something, then you have to be extra careful with it. So that's, you know, a lot of this is just common sense. Respiratory precautions, and they do this a lot with COVID, having a private room with a closed door. We used to say that gowns and gloves were not required because it's a respiratory infection, but now with COVID, of course, they are using gowns and gloves with that because they did not know how easily it could be transferred. They knew at the beginning it was more contagious than usual. So what they're trying to avoid then is secondary contamination. Usually with regular old respiratory precautions, as long as you have face masks and you're washing your hands when you're done, you're okay. But as we come across more infectious diseases, then we take extra precautions. So if that seems like we should not have done the gowns and the gloves, We always will do that when we're not sure. Drainage and secretion precautions. So this is when you are cleaning a drainage tube from somebody, or a secretion that's coming off of a boil, for example. Again, not as much of the precautionary measures, because a lot of these are not going to be organisms that can easily get into you as long as you have intact epithelium and don't get those secretions into your mucous membranes. Okay, but I will give you an example of what happened to my sister once. She's a nurse, and she had a patient who was having some weird respiratory issues. This was not a COVID patient. This was before that. And his blood oxygen levels were rising and falling. They were trying to get under control, and they thought they had, and he was resting and everything was fine. And then all of a sudden his blood ox alarm went off, like plummeted, I mean, just dropped precipitously, extremely fast. And so they went in there, and his lungs were filling up with fluid extremely quickly. And they then, when they put the tube in to intubate, it released the fluid that was in his lung, that was collecting in his lungs, and it projected across the entire room this bloody fluid everywhere, and my sister was just covered in it. So that would be an example of this one where a gown and gloves certainly would have been nice. She had to completely change after that situation. And it was even featured in a little article talking about unusual situations in hospitals. But they saved the guy's life. His blood ox essentially was nothing. That happened, and then they helped him recover after that. So it was kind of a crazy situation. But okay, anyway. If something is highly virulent, then a private room may be necessary. This is, again, very COVID specific here, but this could be something where you have a burn victim and you want to protect them from everything. So nobody can come in unless they are fully gowned and masked, because if you have extensive burns, then your body is susceptible to catching just normal bacteria that would not be a problem for anybody else. Okay, same thing kind of with this reverse isolation. You're isolating the patient. You're not worried about the nurses getting an infection. You're worried about the patient being protected. Okay. Oh, I see one. We talked about signs and symptoms, but I didn't mention syndrome. A syndrome is a collection of signs and symptoms that indicate a disease. So, for example, COVID would have the signs of a fever and coughing and aches and tiredness. And the symptoms of tiredness and aching, and those signs and symptoms together would be a syndrome of COVID. Does that make sense? So a syndrome is all the signs and symptoms that indicate that you have an infection. Oh, okay, I didn't go over these terms. So latency or latent infections are ones that kind of hide for a little while. So you could be a carrier with a latent infection, so it hides for a little while and comes out later. What am I thinking of? Shingles will do that. So if you had chicken pox, then you have that virus inside of you, and then it's a latent infection because it's still there, and it could come out, but when it comes out, it's going to exhibit as a shingles infection. Okay, and then sequelae is when you have a disease that comes after another disease. Okay, so in your disease quiz notes for the diseases that you have to memorize, There are some sequelae in there, especially in the bacterial section. And especially with strep throat. Strep throat has a lot of sequelae that come after it. So strep throat is caused by streptococcal pharyngitis. And then if that is not treated, then other diseases can come from that, okay? Oops. Okay. Shingles is a sequelae of chickenpox. Reservoir is and usually an organism, but it could also be just a place where a pathogen is hanging out. So it's any place that a pathogen can live. And the source is where you can catch it from. So various things can be a source. They're kind of generalized terms. The terms asymptomatic, that literally means without symptoms. Chronic means that you have an infection for a very long time. And passive means that you have it, but it's not doing anything to you. It's acting passively inside of you.